Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Margie Mason and Robin McDowell, investigative reporters for the Associated Press, who have just come out with a massive piece of reporting. And congratulations to both of you. That has been you've been working on for at least 2 years, I guess. That basically follows the work of prisoners and where the end products of that work ends up. Robin, let's start with you. Give us a sense of like where, in the course of your reporting, where were the places that you guys looked for the where this labor was taking place?
Okay. We really looked all over the country. We put out public records requests in all 50 states or spoke to public information officials. And then we also went to numerous states. But I would say really the focus in terms of the hard labor or the things that were really kind of the most brutal conditions were largely in the South.
And Margie, give us a sense of like what these working conditions are. I mean, I think because people, I think have a broad sense that, oh, sure, yeah, prisoners work. Maybe they go and they work in the mess hall or they do the physical plant of the building, and that conceivably there are like work programs. But that's not what we're talking about here.
Well, I think there's different types of work. That's certainly one type of work, and it's a major part of the work that incarcerated people are tasked with doing. So, they could be doing the laundry, they could be working in the kitchen, mopping the floors, and those jobs are generally not paying very much money. Most jobs aren't paying very much money, just a few cents or maybe nothing at all. We also looked at jobs that were specifically tied to agriculture and on prison farms. And I think this is the thing where most people probably don't even realize that these farms still exist in some places. We found, people working on these farms. Again, you could be in a state where you are sentenced to hard labor and you are forced to work, and you can be punished if you refuse to work. So that means that you could be sent to solitary confinement, or you could face privileges being pulled from you, or maybe you would lose a chance at your parole. And yes, we found that, in some states, there are people working in the fields. These are on farms that were former slave plantations. And I think that was a surprise to us, and I think to a lot of readers as well.
Well, you highlight, I mentioned this to you in the break, but that, my sister did some work highlighting Angola, and that's a huge feature of your piece. People may not have a sense, who are in the Northeast or in the West, of like these sprawling prison complexes where it's really there to force these prisoners into these really, really low wage jobs, essentially, while they're in prison. And in Angola in particular, it's also performing for people in the neighborhood when they do this kind of rodeo thing, which is quite dehumanizing. But can you give people a sense of the scale of these facilities, places like Angola, places in the South, and how many prisoners are actually doing work for corporations? Either of you?
Yeah, sure. I'll just scoot back a little bit and just point out build a little bit on what Margie was saying about the industry of prison labor and really how big it is. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. We chose to focus on agriculture, which is really just a sliver of that, because it shows kind of a through line of how did we get here from slavery to the convict leasing period to laws that have passed over the years, making it easier and easier to send goods across state lines. So that's really a lot of this investigation was kind of putting it in that historical context. We were really interested in the plantations or penal farms in the South, because that's where you really see that through line most clearly. Angola is vast. It's 18,000 acres. It was a former slave plantation owned for a period by one of the biggest slave traders in the United States. And then after slavery ended and they passed the 13th Amendment, allowing people to continue working if they had been convicted of crime. You started seeing people being rounded up in Louisiana as well and put to work on the same plantation after slavery ended. So that's something we're still seeing. And over, like one of the most remarkable things for us was looking at photographs from just a few years ago and comparing it over time and just seeing how similar it was. But Angola was.
Robin, you said you guys focused on the agricultural part of this, implying that there's whole other sort of like, I guess, silos, if you will, or verticals of other industries. And I understand you didn't do the reporting in those areas, but do you have a sense of like what we're talking about? And if we're talking billions of dollars in the context of agriculture, what are we talking about? What other industries are we talking about? And then I want to go to Margie about the sort of like the nature of the work, but or the safety, the standards, I should say. But do you have a sense of like what the other industries are and what we're talking about in terms of dollars?
Well, I think the biggest chunk, like Margie was saying, is really maintaining the facilities. So the laundry, kitchen, swamping, those sort of things. But then there are also other businesses that you think of when you think of prison labor as Americans, usually license plates, making license plates, or building office furniture, or military uniforms, or solar panels. It goes on and on.
But they're not going out. Well, I guess building solar panels, but are they going into factories? Are they producing components of, I don't know, vehicles? Or are they components of machinery? Or are they, I don't know, chopping trees down? Are they mining for stuff?
It really depends on the facility and the program. But if you're working inside a prison, say with the license plates, they're actually putting the film on the license plates and making them in the prison. You can also be leased out in certain places to companies to kind of work on the grounds there, as we found in Arizona with Hickman's egg farm. So it really depends. Also, there's at this point so many different types of prison labor, including prison industries programs, which work with joint partners to kind of have a formal agreement with the corrections industry, in which case they can leave the facility, or sometimes it's the work release center. It just depends on the state, really.
And can you talk a bit about the wages and how those contracts with those prisons, it helps depress them to this incredibly low level so they can have things to buy at the commissary or make a phone call or send an email, but the amount of work that many of these prisoners have to do to get to that threshold. Maybe Margie, you can take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, if they're just doing kind of the maintenance work, they're making, oftentimes just pennies an hour. And so, yes, it's, they're having to buy things from the commissary. They're having to buy things like deodorant, soap. I know we talked with women and they were saying that, they would get feminine hygiene products once a month or whatever, but it was never enough, toilet paper even. But then you have, a lot of people that we talked to, they were happy to have these outside jobs. And let us stress that these outside jobs, they pay more, but there are a few of them. It's a much smaller percentage of the work. And so with those jobs, what you have is you have them going out and oftentimes working. Robin mentioned Hickman's egg farm out in Arizona. They've been working out there for 30 years and they get paid more. But what ends up happening is the state comes in and they take like the, right off the top of their wages, they'll take like the correctional industries will take a chunk. And then the actual state comes in, the prison comes in and takes 30% for room and board. And they also get charged, a fee for like things like electricity. And what we found in this particular case with Hickman's, it was really interesting, is that during the pandemic, we think it was unprecedented. They actually moved like 140 women from the prison to the farm. They put them in a barn-like structure. It was a big like dormitory type structure, and housed them there for over a year so that they could continue working during the pandemic. And even while they were still living off-site away from the prison, the state was still garnishing 30% of their wages for room and board.
Let's just talk, Margie, a little bit about the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was in many ways a way of like making sure that we had a labor force in the wake of saying that we don't allow for slavery. And in fact, there was a big jump in the number of formerly freed slaves that we imprisoned as a country within years. And a significant portion of that sort of free labor that was gone with the abolishment of slavery ended up being replenished with free labor from convicts. And like you say, it still doesn't look that different in some of those places, like Angola, for that matter. But what obligations? And the 13th Amendment, just to remind people, says you can basically be a slave if you're in prison. And it's the only circumstance where you can basically be enslaved in terms of work. But is there any provision for worker standards for these people? Like, small, it's, I guess, it's a subsidiary question to whether you should be forced to work at that point. But are there any standards whatsoever? And if so, where do they come from?
Well, I think this is a really interesting thing. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this story was really kind of take people back on a journey through history in a way, because I think that we learned a lot in this reporting. The 13th Amendment after the Civil War abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, but there is a clause in there, and it says, except if you're convicted of a crime. And some people refer to this as the punishment clause. And so then what happened is that after emancipation, in the South especially, where it was, the economy was shattered and they were trying to rebuild, they started rounding up mostly young Black men and imprisoning them for very minor things like loitering or vagrancy or very, very minor crimes. And they were sending them off to work. They were leasing them out to, coal mines, railroads, these big industries. And they were working them and beating them. And oftentimes the death rate was quite high. And so that was the convict leasing era. And that really was kind of the foundation for prison labor that we've built upon to today. And then to answer your question about the standards, it's interesting because what we found was that, in some states, it's actually spelled out in the statute that if you are incarcerated and you're a worker, you are not an employee. And as such, you are not entitled to the same benefits or rights or protections that other American workers receive. So in some cases, what we found was even if you're standing and working side by side with somebody else who's a quote unquote free worker, you might, if you get hurt as an incarcerated worker, you might not be entitled to things like, say, workers' compensation or disability benefits, or it's very hard in many instances for incarcerated workers to sue for wrongful death, let's just say. So it's almost like there's a gray area that you're in. And so, we've asked the question, well, what happens if you get really seriously injured or if you're killed on the job? What happens if, say, you lose a limb and then you get out of prison and then you find it difficult to work, but you're not entitled again to the same benefits as other workers?
Lastly, Robin, what are the companies that you essentially made aware that like how much a lot of them seem to say like, oh, well, we have a policy against that. We don't do that. We used to do that. We don't do that anymore. And you guys literally followed, in some instances, trucks full of cattle to where they were going. They were sold then at auction and they end up in this one place. Like there is a quality to this of like, oh, well, that's our subcontractor. So that's not us. But has there been any movement? Is there any response to this in legislatures or at the corporate level?
Well, I think it really depends on what companies you're talking about. You have some companies, big, commodity traders, for instance, that are buying directly from the prisons, and they're very aware of that. Cargill, for instance, said that they did have legacy purchases, and they were going to review that now and look at possible remedial actions. But a lot of the companies, when we reached out to them originally, had not seen the story. We told them basically what our findings were. And our sense really now is they're kind of knocking heads and trying to figure out, well, what do we do? Technically, it's legal. But there also is kind of a climate in the country now that re-examines some of our policies, and might not agree with companies that say, okay, we're not doing anything wrong here.
Well, hopefully your piece gets widely read. Margie Mason, Robin McDowell, investigative reporters for the Associated Press. The piece is "Prisoners in the U.S. are part of a hidden workforce linked to hundreds of popular food brands." We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.